On October 9th, at exactly 6:18 p.m., my mother-in-law stood up in the middle of a family dinner, tapped her glass with a spoon, and said, "I wasn't planning to say this tonight, but since everyone is here, it's time." There were 14 people in the room. Grandparents, aunts, cousins, my husband's younger siblings, and my kind 9-year-old son sitting on the carpet behind the sofa, building a Lego tower taller than himself. The room went quiet. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a stapled bundle of papers, thick, at least 20 pages. She didn't hand it to my husband. She walked straight past him and placed it in front of me. The cover page read, "The reasons my son should divorce you." Handwritten, numbered, neat cursive, blue ink. I remember the date at the top of the page. September 1st. Exactly. 3 days on before my son's birthday. My husband laughed nervously. "Mom, what is this?" She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on me. "Just honesty," she said. "Something you've avoided for years." No one spoke. No one moved. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Someone's phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. I picked up the papers. Reason number 1. She never truly respected our family values. Reason number 2. She isolates my son from people who matter. Reason number 3. She spends money irresponsibly. Each line had a date beside it. Some had notes in the margins. Little arrows, emphasis marks. By the reason number 6, my hands were cold. By reason 11, I realized this wasn't written in one sitting. This was a document built over years. Reason number 14 referenced a private argument between my husband and me. One that happened in our bedroom, with the door closed. Reason number 19 accused me of emotional manipulation and cited an exact sentence I had said during a panic attack. I looked up. My husband was pale. His sister stared at the floor. One aunt slowly set her glass down like it was suddenly too heavy. My mother-in-law crossed her arms. "I've stayed quiet long enough," she continued. "I watched you change my son. I watched him shrink. And I will not let my grandson grow up thinking this is normal." I felt my chest tighten, but my face stayed still. When I reached the reason 27 line, my stomach dropped. It mentioned my son by name. By unreason thar 34 she questioned my mental stability. By not reason 41, she suggested I had married her son for security. And a reason 42, the last line, was underlined twice. She is the reason my son is failing in life. No one defended me. Not one person said my name. I closed the packet carefully and placed it back on the table. My mother-in-law leaned forward, satisfied. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," she said. "I'm saying it because divorce doesn't have to be ugly if it's done early." That was when my son stood up. He walked over, looked at the papers, then looked at me. "Mom," he asked, "are we leaving?" I smiled at him. "In a minute, sweetheart." I turned back to the table. My voice didn't shake when I spoke. "Before anyone says anything," I said, "I just want to ask one question." My mother-in-law raised an eyebrow. "Yes? Is this the final version?" She hesitated. Just long enough for me to notice. "Yes," she said. "Everything." I nodded, because what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that I had already found something she never meant for me to see. And once it came out, those 42 reasons would mean nothing at all. Before that night, my life looked ordinary in the way people rarely question. I woke up at a 5:45 a.m. every weekday. Not because I had to, but because I liked the quiet. I made coffee, packed my son's lunch, checked my emails, and reviewed the day before the house woke up. Order calmed me. It always had. I worked as an operations analyst for a regional logistics company. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't loud in meetings. But I was dependable. I caught errors before they became problems. I kept systems running smoothly enough that no one noticed, until something went wrong, and suddenly everyone needed me. I liked that role. Invisible competence. At home, I handled most things without discussion. Bills, school forms, doctor appointments, birthday gifts for Daniel's family. I kept a shared calendar, color-coded, updated weekly. Daniel used to joke that I was the responsible one. I never corrected him. He worked in sales. Good with people, bad with details. He forgot passwords, missed deadlines, and relied on reminders. Not maliciously, just passively. If someone else would do it, he let them. That had been his role long before he met me. His older sister Lauren was the opposite. She filled every room she entered. Growing up, she was the star. Debate team, prom court, internship connections handed to her before she asked. Every family story somehow ended with Lauren being impressive, misunderstood or unfairly treated by someone else. When she failed a licensing exam, the family blamed the test. When she quit a job after 3 months, it was toxic management. When she borrowed money and didn't pay it back, it was a rough patch. Their mother never said Lauren was better than Daniel. She didn't need to. Praise followed Lauren like perfume. Daniel got encouragement when he stayed out of the way. Their father, Richard, balanced things by avoiding them. He was polite, soft-spoken, the kind of man who asked if everyone wanted more potatoes while tension sat, untouched in the room. When disagreements surfaced, he smoothed them over with humor or silence. "That's just how your mother is," he'd say. Or, "Let's not make a big deal out of it." I didn't resent him. I just noticed the pattern. In the early years of our marriage, things stayed civil. My mother-in-law was involved. She had opinions about how I cooked, how I dressed my son, how often I visited my own parents, but she framed everything as concern. "You'll understand when you've been a mother as long as I have. I just want what's best for my family." I adjusted. I compromised. I chose peace. Daniel appreciated that. Or maybe he just benefited from it. When our son was born, the balance shifted slightly. Suddenly I mattered more, at least publicly. Grandmotherhood suited her. She brought gifts, posted photos, took credit for traditions she hadn't started. Privately, the advice intensified. "You shouldn't go back to work so soon. Daycare changes children. Daniel needs more support right now." I listened. I nodded. I didn't argue. Because on the surface, my life was stable. Comfortable, even. We owned a modest home. Our bills were paid. Our son was healthy and happy. There was no obvious conflict. No shouting. No cruelty you could point to and name. Just contrast. Lauren's chaos was absorbed and forgiven. Daniel's passivity was protected. And I became the quiet constant holding everything together. I didn't see myself as a threat. I didn't think anyone saw me as one either. But looking back, that was the mistake. Because when someone builds their sense of control on being needed, the person who needs nothing becomes dangerous. I just didn't know yet that my calm, competent life, my silence, my order, my independence was already being recorded somewhere else. Measured, interpreted, saved, and turned into something it was never meant to be. It didn't happen all at once. That's what made it easy to miss. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it seemed too small to matter. My mother-in-law offered to help with our taxes one year, saying she'd done them forever, and it would save us money. She asked for our documents early, W-2s, bank statements, childcare receipts. I handed them over without hesitation. When I asked later if everything was filed, she said yes. When I asked for a copy, she laughed. "Why would you need that?" I let it go. Then there were the comments, always framed as concern, always delivered softly. At a birthday party, while everyone watched my son open gifts, she leaned over and whispered, "You should really limit sugar. Hyperactivity can be a sign of deeper issues." When I smiled politely, she added, "I'm just worried. You tend to miss those things." Another time, she asked me, loud enough for others to hear, whether I was still struggling after the baby. When I said I wasn't, she nodded slowly like she didn't believe me. Daniel started repeating her questions at home. "Mom thinks maybe you're overwhelmed. She says you might need more help. She's just worried about you." If I disagreed, he'd look confused. "I'm not accusing you of anything." But the doubt lingered. At family gatherings, she corrected my stories mid-sentence. If I said Daniel and I had decided something together, she'd interrupt. "Well, Daniel mentioned something different to me." When I asked Daniel about it later, he couldn't remember saying that. Or he'd say, "She probably misunderstood." Misunderstandings became frequent. Mail started arriving already opened. "Oh," she'd say lightly, "I thought it was for us." Once, I noticed a bank notification on Daniel's phone, an account I didn't recognize. When I asked him about it, he shrugged. "Mom helped me set that up years ago. It's nothing." The balance didn't make sense. When I tried to ask follow-up questions, his tone shifted. Defensive. "Why are you making this a thing?" So I stopped asking. The next phase was isolation. She'd plan family events and forget to tell me, or tell Daniel at the last minute, so if we couldn't attend, it looked like my fault. If I suggested visiting my parents, she'd sigh dramatically. "Of course. You always choose them. When my son started school, she volunteered often. Too often. She corrected teachers in front of other parents. She told people she was basically raising him. One afternoon, my son came home quiet. When I asked what was wrong, he said, "Grandma says you don't like her very much." I asked her about it gently. She looked genuinely surprised. I would never say that. Then after a pause, "But children sense tension. Maybe you should reflect on that." Daniel asked me why I'd upset his mother. I started keeping notes, not because I planned anything, just because I needed to know I wasn't imagining patterns, dates, comments, situations. I noticed how often she spoke for me, how she rephrased my words, how she volunteered information about my mental state, my finances, my marriage, without ever asking me. I noticed how often people nodded. The gaslighting wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. If I reacted emotionally, I was unstable. If I stayed calm, I was cold. If I spoke up, I was aggressive. If I stayed silent, I was hiding something. There was no winning position. One incident still stands out. During a holiday dinner, she announced she'd decided to start a college fund for my son. Everyone applauded. She looked at me expectantly. I smiled and thanked her. Later that night, she pulled me aside. "You'll need to sign something," she said, "just so there's no confusion." The document gave her sole control. When I hesitated, she laughed softly. "Don't be paranoid." Daniel urged me to sign. "It's generous. Why are you making it awkward?" I signed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Another time, she told me she was worried about my spending. She mentioned a number, 18,600, that she claimed I'd wasted over 2 years. The number was precise. Too precise. When I asked where it came from, she said, "Daniel showed me." He hadn't. When I confronted him, he looked stunned. I never said that. When I mentioned it to her again, she frowned. "I think you're misremembering." The family started treating me differently. Less eye contact, more polite distance, private conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I was no longer a person. I was a topic. And slowly I realized something else. She wasn't trying to hurt me emotionally. She was building a record. Every concern, every comment, every worry, documented, organized, repeated. Not loudly, not angrily, methodically. By the time I understood what she was doing, the story about me was already circulating, quietly, confidently, without my input. And I didn't yet know how much power she thought she had. The invitation arrived 2 weeks before the dinner. Not a text, not a casual call. A printed card, slipped into our mailbox like something formal and celebratory. Family Appreciation Night. That was what it said on the front, written in my mother-in-law's familiar blue ink. Inside, it listed the date, October 9th, and the time, 9 p.m. sharp. It mentioned a special announcement and asked that everyone make every effort to attend. When I showed it to Daniel, he smiled. "See, she's trying." Something in my chest tightened. My mother-in-law had never hosted anything without a reason. Every gathering had a purpose, a narrative, someone being elevated or corrected. Still, I said nothing. In the days leading up to it, the small things intensified. She called Daniel more often. Long conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. When I asked what they talked about, he shrugged. "Just family stuff." She stopped calling me altogether. At school pickup, one of the other parents mentioned how lucky my son was to have such an involved grandmother. The tone wasn't unkind, just informed. I started receiving messages from relatives I rarely heard from. "Hope everything's okay. Thinking of you." Families go through seasons. No one explained what they meant. At a grocery store, I ran into Daniel's aunt. She hugged me tightly. Too tightly. "You're doing your best," she whispered. I went home and opened my notebook. I reread old entries, dates, patterns, financial numbers that didn't align, accounts that existed without my knowledge, documents I'd signed without copies. I felt a familiar unease, not panic, not fear, recognition. This wasn't impulsive. It was staged. 2 days before the dinner, my mother-in-law called me directly. Her voice was sweet, almost gentle. "I just want tonight to be peaceful," she said. "No surprises?" I agreed. The morning of October 9th, my son asked if we were dressing up. "Grandma said it's important," he said. I ironed his shirt. Before we left, Daniel hesitated by the door. "Let's just not argue tonight," he said. I looked at him. "About what?" He didn't answer. At the house, the atmosphere was strange, polite, tense, too controlled. Chairs were arranged carefully. The table was cleared early. Dessert was set aside like a reward waiting to be earned. I noticed my mother-in-law's folder on the sideboard. Thick. Familiar. An older relative, Daniel's great-aunt Margaret, caught my eye as I poured drinks. She watched me for a long moment, then said quietly, "You look tired." I smiled. "I'm fine." She shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "You look prepared." Before I could respond, my mother-in-law called everyone to the table. As we sat, Margaret leaned closer and whispered, "Whatever happens, remember who you are." Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The clock struck the 6:18 p.m. That was when my mother-in-law stood up. I didn't know yet what she planned to say, but I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't there to be celebrated. I was there to be presented. When my mother-in-law stood, the room obeyed her without question. Forks paused midair. Conversation stopped. Even the children seemed to sense something shifting, their voices lowering as if an invisible hand had pressed down on the room. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't smile. "I want to thank everyone for coming," she said. "Family is important, especially when hard truths need to be addressed." No one looked at me, not yet. She reached for the folder on the sideboard. Thick. Organized. Tabs, visible along the edge. She carried it like evidence. "This isn't easy for me," she continued, her voice steady. "But I've stayed silent for years, and silence helps no one." She placed the folder on the table and opened it. I felt Daniel shift beside me. He didn't speak. "I've made notes over time," she said. "Out of concern. Out of love." She slid a stapled packet toward me. The same careful blue ink. Numbered pages. 42 reasons, she said, that my son should seriously consider divorce. A breath left the room all at once. Someone gasped quietly. Someone else cleared their throat. A chair scraped as a cousin leaned back, uncomfortable. I didn't move. She began reading. Reason 1 was about my upbringing. Reason 2 about my attitude. Reason 3 about my work schedule. She didn't rush. She let each line settle. She doesn't prioritize family. She creates emotional distance. She refuses guidance. With every sentence, she looked around the table, making eye contact, gathering agreement without asking for it. When she reached the section titled Motherhood Concerns, the silence became heavy. She limits access. She undermines authority. She confuses the child. My son's name was spoken, casually, publicly. I felt something twist in my chest, but my hands stayed folded in my lap. Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, maybe this isn't the right forum." She raised a hand. "This affects everyone." She referenced dates, conversations, private moments I had never consented to share. She quoted me inaccurately, confidently. She said she felt trapped, my mother-in-law claimed. I hadn't. She moved on. "She's financially irresponsible," she said, tapping the page. "Over $18,600 in unnecessary expenses between 2018 and 2020. Heads turned toward me. No one asked for context. No one asked me to explain. Lauren watched with thinly veiled satisfaction. When my mother-in-law reached the final page, she paused. "I'm not asking for drama," she said. "I'm asking for clarity." She turned to Daniel. "You deserve better." The room waited. I looked at Daniel. He didn't look back. I picked up the packet. The pages shook slightly, not from fear but from restraint. I closed it and placed it carefully on the table. "I understand," I said. My voice was calm. Too calm for what they expected. "I just want to ask one thing." My mother-in-law tilted her head. "Yes?" "Before this goes any further," I said, "does anyone here believe this document is complete? That it represents the full truth?" Silence. Margaret shifted in her chair. "I've tried to speak up," I continued. "I've been told I misunderstood, that I was sensitive, that I was imagining things." I looked directly at my mother-in-law. "So I want to be sure," I said. "This is everything." She smiled, small, confident. "Yes," she said. "Everything that matters." I nodded, and for the first time that night, I saw uncertainty flicker across a few faces, because something in my tone had changed. I stood up. Not abruptly. Not angrily. "I won't argue," I said. "I won't defend myself." Murmurs rippled through the room. "But since we're sharing records," I added, "I think it's only fair that everyone sees mine." Daniel looked at me then. Really looked. "What do you mean?" he asked. I met his eyes. I I said quietly. That I didn't come unprepared. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before, not explosive, expectant. And somewhere in that silence, the power in the room shifted. Some people believe public humiliation justifies itself. Others believe truth does. Which do you think lasts longer? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesture dramatically or accuse anyone of anything. I simply reached into my bag and pulled out a slim accordion. Folder, beige, unmarked. The kind people use for boring things, insurance papers, warranties, instruction manuals. The contrast mattered. My mother-in-law's folder was thick and theatrical. Mine was quiet. I didn't plan to share this tonight, I said. But since my character, my marriage, and my parenting have been formally documented, I think accuracy matters. No one interrupted. I placed the folder on the table and opened it. Let's start with finances, I said, flipping to the first section. Since that seems to be a recurring concern. I slid a single page forward. This is a bank statement from an account opened in ITC. Daniel's name in Tapon 9. He was 19. Daniel leaned forward. I don't remember this. I know, I said. That's why I asked the bank for the original account opening documents. I turned the page. Here's the signature card, I said. Your name is printed. Not signed. I paused. But this signature is. I turned the page toward the table. My mother-in-law's handwriting, identical to the blue ink on her 42 Reasons. A few people shifted in their seats. This account was used regularly until Menina 2017. I continued. Primarily for withdrawals, not deposits. I read the number slowly. Total withdrawn, 64,480. Daniel stared at the page. That money, I said, was supposed to be his college fund. My mother-in-law spoke for the first time since I stood. That's misleading, she said. Families share resources. I nodded. Agreed, that's why I didn't stop there. I pulled out another document. This is a credit card statement. Opened in Narcissistic, also in Daniel's name. Lauren frowned. I've never seen that. Neither had we, I said. Until a collection notice arrived, addressed to me. I let that sit. Balance at the time of discovery. 18,642. A familiar number. I looked at my mother-in-law. That's the amount you accused me of wasting. Her lips pressed together. The charges, I continued, include airline tickets, hotel stays, and retail purchases, none of which align with my schedule or location. I slid over a timeline. Dates, cities, receipts. I was at work, or home with a newborn, or in a different state. No one spoke. Daniel's voice was hoarse. Mom? She didn't answer. I moved on. These are tax filings from 2018 and 9, I said. Filed jointly, or so I thought. I pointed to a line. Here's an education credit claimed for a dependent. Margaret leaned closer. That dependent isn't the child. No, I said. It's Lauren. Lauren's head snapped up. What? The credit was claimed using Daniel's social security number, I said. But the beneficiary was you. Lauren looked at her mother. Mom. My mother-in-law waved a hand. It was temporary. It was efficient. It was illegal, I said, calmly, and it triggered an audit. I flipped another page. This is correspondence from the IRS, I said. Addressed to me, because my name was on the return. Daniel's breathing was shallow now. I didn't rush. These are copies of emails I sent asking for clarification, I continued, and the responses I received. I read one aloud. You worry too much. Let me handle it. Another, you don't understand how these things work. Another, stop being dramatic. I closed the folder slightly. I was told I was financially irresponsible, I said. Unstable, confused. I looked around the table. So I did what unstable people apparently don't do. I gathered evidence. I showed the spreadsheet next. I tracked discrepancies, I said. Dates, amounts, patterns. Withdrawals clustered around Lauren's life events. Rent gaps, job changes, travel. This wasn't random, I said. It was consistent. My mother-in-law finally raised her voice. You're twisting things. I met her gaze. I haven't used adjectives, I said. Only numbers. Silence. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. I tried, I said. I was told I misunderstood. I turned to the final section. Now, I said, we move to legal matters. That got everyone's attention. These are power of attorney documents, I said. Limited. Signed when Daniel was 20. I paused. They were never revoked. Daniel went still. These documents were used, I continued, to authorize financial actions well into our marriage. Without our knowledge. I looked at my mother-in-law. You told me you were helping, I said. You never told me you were authorized. She stood abruptly. This is a family matter, she snapped. You had no right to dig through. I had every right, I said quietly. My name was attached to the consequences. I slid the last paper forward. This, I said, is a letter from our attorney. I didn't read it aloud. I didn't need to. This situation, I said, has already been reviewed. I didn't bring this here to threaten anyone. I looked at Daniel. I brought it because decisions are being discussed. Divorce, custody, character. I looked back at the table. And those decisions deserve the full record. No one spoke. Not because they were shocked, but because the narrative they had accepted, carefully, quietly, over years, had just collapsed under its own weight. I closed the folder. I'm finished, I said, and sat down. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was irreversible. For a long moment, no one spoke. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone was recalculating. Old memories, old assumptions. Years of quiet explanations suddenly felt unstable. It was Margaret who broke the silence. There's something else, she said. Her voice was thin but steady. Age had taken its softness, not its authority. My mother-in-law turned sharply. This is not the time. Margaret ignored her. I warned you, she said, still looking at me. I told you to remember who you are. The room leaned toward her without realizing it. Margaret placed both hands on the table. You built this story very carefully, she said to my mother-in-law. But you left out the beginning. Daniel frowned. What beginning? Margaret sighed. When Daniel was born, she said, there were complications. My mother-in-law's face tightened. He was sick, Margaret continued. Very sick. The doctors told her he would need long-term care. Possibly for life. Daniel shook his head. That's not true. It was, Margaret said gently. For a while. She turned to me. She was terrified, Margaret said. Not of losing him. Of losing control. The room felt smaller. During that time, Margaret went on, she decided something. She would never be powerless again. Not financially, not emotionally. My mother-in-law stood. That's enough, she said sharply. Margaret didn't stop. She began managing everything, she said. Accounts, records, relationships. She kept Daniel dependent, without appearing cruel. Daniel stared at his mother. Why wouldn't I remember any of this? Because you weren't supposed to, Margaret said. I felt it then, a shift. Not anger, understanding. Margaret looked around the table. And you, she said to the others, were given the version that made her look responsible. Lauren's voice was small. You said you sacrificed everything. My mother-in-law laughed once, bitterly. I did. Margaret shook her head. No, she said. You redirected everything. She turned to me. She never forgave you, Margaret said, for one thing. My chest tightened. You made Daniel independent, Margaret said. Not loudly, not rebelliously, just effectively. She looked at Daniel. She didn't fear losing you, Margaret said. She feared losing access. That was it. The list? The finances. The isolation. Not punishment. Containment. My mother-in-law spoke then, her voice sharp with something close to desperation. You don't understand, she said. If I hadn't managed things, everything would have fallen apart. Daniel stood. You stole from me, he said. I protected you, she snapped. You lied, he said. I guided, she said. Margaret shook her head slowly. This family has covered for you for decades, she said. But tonight you involved the wrong person. She looked at me. You didn't fight back emotionally, she said. You documented. My mother-in-law looked around the table. No one met her eyes. Lauren stood as well. You used my name, she said quietly. You let me think it was normal. Silence fractured into sides. Some people moved away, some stayed frozen. The family line that had always been clear, her at the center, split. I finally spoke. I didn't come here to expose your past, I said. I came here to correct my own. I looked at my mother-in-law. You needed me to be unstable, I said. Because stable people don't need permission. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time, she had no narrative ready. When someone controls the story for years, what happens when the truth finally belongs to everyone? Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. This stops now, she said, her words cutting cleanly through the room. Not tomorrow. Not after we cool off. Now. My mother-in-law looked at her like she'd been betrayed. You're overstepping. I've been stepping aside for 40 years, Margaret replied. And look what grew in the space. No one interrupted. Margaret turned to Daniel. You were kept small, she said. On purpose. That ends tonight. Daniel swallowed hard but nodded. Margaret then faced my mother-in-law fully. You involved lawyers, documents, accusations, she said. So consequences will also be formal. She gestured to the folder I'd brought. Those accounts are to be frozen immediately, Margaret said. The power of attorney is revoked. Any further contact regarding finances goes through counsel. My mother-in-law laughed nervously. You think you can dictate? I already have, Margaret said. Richard, who had been silent the entire night, finally spoke. She's right, he said quietly. Everyone turned. We fix this, he said. Or I won't protect it anymore. My mother-in-law stared at him. You knew? She demanded. I suspected, he said. I chose peace over truth. He looked at Daniel. I'm sorry. That apology landed harder than any accusation. Margaret continued. There will be an audit, she said. Voluntary, if you're wise. Lauren stepped back. I don't want any of it, she said. I didn't ask for this. Margaret nodded. And now you won't receive it. She turned to me. You, she said, are done explaining yourself. I felt something release in my chest. You don't owe anyone comfort, Margaret continued. You gave them facts. That's enough. My mother-in-law looked around the table again. The room had changed. No audience, no allies, no silence to hide behind. I was trying to protect my family, she said weakly. Margaret shook her head. You were protecting your position. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, just a quiet collapse of authority. Margaret addressed everyone else. If anyone continues this behavior, she said, they won't be welcome in my home. Or my life. No one objected. Daniel came and stood beside me. I'm not discussing divorce, he said. I'm discussing recovery. He looked at his mother. You don't get access to our son until trust exists, he said. And that will take time. My mother-in-law opened her mouth. Margaret raised a finger. Enough. That was the final word. We didn't stay long after that. As we gathered our things, people avoided my mother-in-law's gaze. Conversations stopped when she entered a space. Not cruelty, consequences. At the door, Margaret hugged me. You did well, she said. You stayed whole. I nodded. Outside, the night air felt different, lighter. I hadn't won. I'd simply stopped losing myself. The weeks after that night were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful at first, quiet in the way. A house feels after something structural has shifted. No echoes, no background noise, just space where tension used to live. The audit began within 10 days. Professionals, neutral voices, clear processes. I didn't sit in the room for most of it. I didn't need to. I had already done my part. I answered questions when asked, provided documents when requested. Then I stepped back. For the first time in years, I let other people carry what wasn't mine. Daniel struggled, not in loud ways, in pauses, in moments where he stared at nothing, recalculating his entire childhood. He went to therapy, on his own, without me suggesting it. That mattered. We talked more honestly than we ever had. Not about blame, about patterns, about how easy it is to confuse control with care when it's all you've known. Our son noticed changes too. He stopped asking why Grandma was upset. He stopped repeating things that weren't his words. One night, while I tucked him in, he said, "You're not quiet anymore." I smiled. "I was always quiet," I said. "I'm just not small." The financial mess took months to untangle. Accounts were closed, credit reports corrected, a restitution plan was established. Slowly, methodically, my name was separated from things I had never agreed to carry. The relief wasn't dramatic. It was functional. Bills that matched reality, mail that arrived unopened, numbers that made sense again. I slept better. So did Daniel. My mother-in-law didn't apologize. She didn't need to. She lost access. Not just to money or influence, but to narratives. People stopped asking her for explanations, stopped deferring, stopped adjusting themselves around her moods. She became peripheral, not punished, repositioned. Lauren moved away within 3 months. New city, new job, new story. She and I don't talk much, but when we do, it's honest. That's enough. Richard visits occasionally, alone. He brings books for our son. He doesn't explain the past. He doesn't excuse it either. That too is enough. Margaret calls me every Sunday. Not to check in, to talk about ordinary things. Weather, recipes, family history. That doesn't come with conditions. She treats me like someone who belongs. At work, I was promoted. Not because of the chaos, but because the absence of it let me focus. My manager said something that stayed with me. "You're very steady," she said. People trust that. I thought about how steadiness had once been used against me, how calm had been mistaken for weakness. At home, Daniel and I rebuilt routines intentionally, shared calendars again, but this time transparently. Decisions made together. No intermediaries, no quiet overrides. We didn't rush forgiveness. We didn't pretend everything was fixed. We chose clarity instead. The strangest part was the silence from extended family. No follow-up questions. No requests for explanations. I realized then that many of them hadn't believed the story as deeply as they'd pretended. They had simply found it easier not to challenge it. When the story collapsed, they let it go. I stopped needing validation from that. One afternoon, I found the notebook where I'd kept records for years. Dates, quotes, numbers. I considered keeping it. Then I shredded it. Not because it was wrong, because I didn't need proof of my own reality anymore. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was done. Done explaining. Done shrinking. Done carrying other people's discomfort as my responsibility. The envelope with the 42 reasons still exists somewhere. It doesn't matter where. It no longer describes me. I didn't rebuild my life loudly. I rebuilt it accurately. And that made all the difference. Sometimes I think about that night. The table, the silence. The moment power shifted without a single raised voice. And I understand something now that I didn't then. Control depends on confusion. Clarity ends it. I know who I am. I know what I did and didn't do. And I no longer need anyone else to agree. If you were in that room, watching silence choose a side, what would you have done? And what would you hope to do differently now?